Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
That was a lie. Perhaps the single most consequential lie of the 21st century. On February 5th, 2003, at roughly 11:03 AM local time, Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations. His task was to convince the UN that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Bush and Congress had already decided to invade. What the administration still needed was a justification strong enough to convince the American public and the rest of the world. Even in 2003, many doubted whether invading Iraq was necessary at all. But those doubts quieted down after the most respected politician in Bush's administration, Colin Powell, assured both Americans and the world that an invasion of Iraq was necessary. He held up a small vial and told the world that Iraq was hiding deadly stockpiles. Today we know that evidence was false, fabricated. It was a lie. Colin Powell lied to the entire world and in doing so cleared the final hurdles for an invasion of Iraq, an invasion that would kill millions and destabilize an entire region for decades. Powell later called that UN speech the lowest point of his career, because even back then he knew that the evidence he presented was weak at best, and that begs the question, what if Colin Powell didn't lie? If Bush and Congress already made up their minds, why does this lie even matter? Why make a whole video about changing the words of a single man over 20 years ago? Well, Bush and Congress might have been convinced invading Iraq is a good idea, but the public and international community weren't. There was a lot of skepticism about Bush's plans, both at home and abroad. But why did Colin Powell even lie? Quick side note, I'm getting close to 20,000 subscribers and it would be insane if he reached that number before the end of the year. Anyway, back in 2003, Dick Cheney basically controlled the Bush administration, and Dick Cheney really wanted to invade Iraq. And this war-hungry Dick Cheney pressured Powell into giving the speech. Cheney presented weak evidence and told Powell to sell it as undeniable. Powell caved, fearing that refusing would hurt his career or leaving him blamed if Iraq actually had weapons of mass destruction. But in this alternate world, Colin Powell doesn't listen to those fears. Instead, he stays true to his principles. In late January of 2003, he receives and reviews the intelligence for his planned UN speech. Just like in our time, he notices how weak the evidence is. But this time, he quickly cancels his speech. Behind closed doors, he urges Bush to delay the invasion until further evidence can be brought up. But Bush had already made up his mind. The administration was already ready to invade. But what happens when the world's most trusted general refuses to play along? By early February, news of Powell cancelling his UN speech quickly make waves. He quickly goes public and explains in interviews that the evidence against Iraq simply isn't strong enough. Just imagine seeing Colin Powell on TV going against everything Bush and co are claiming. The media wouldn't be able to look away. Congress was in favor of the invasion and the majority of the American public stood behind it. But back in 2003, Colin Powell was far more popular and trusted than George W. Bush or actually almost any politician. And the American public wasn't as hell-bent on invading Iraq as you might think. Yes, Americans were very patriotic post 9/11, but they were also cautious. And many polls show that Americans would only support the Iraq war with UN approval. Without Powell's credibility, the war goes from inevitable to deeply controversial overnight. Millions who trust Powell more than Bush suddenly doubt if Iraq really has weapons of mass destruction. Suddenly, the New York Times, CNN and co. heavily question the invasion, and Pentagon officials get bombarded with questions on live air. The Bush administration, meanwhile, goes into damage control. Several Republicans go on record stating that they find the evidence compelling and are continuing to back the invasion. Some hawks even openly demand that Powell resigns. Donald Rumsfeld goes so far to publicly call Powell a traitor, but with Powell's statement, some Republicans, like Chuck Hagel, openly go against Bush. And even some who previously were in favor of the war, like John McCain, now flip their script. Bush, meanwhile, is furious and feels betrayed, and inside his mind a new political calculation begins to form. If he invades Iraq with his now fractured cabinet and it turns out that Powell was right, there is no way he'll win the 2004 election. And while Dick Cheney certainly would still invade Iraq even if it meant losing re-election, George W. Bush is still the president. By mid-February, the Iraq question is all you hear on the news. New York Times headlines read, Washington about to invade Iraq, but is war necessary? And people now also are asking themselves, is it really necessary to risk American lives because of some weak evidence? But the biggest impact Powell has isn't even inside the US, because without Colin Powell, the US loses its best diplomatic salesman. France, Germany, Russia and China now feel emboldened in opposing the war. Heated debates break out in the UN Security Council and support for the invasion quickly collapses. And America's strongest partner, the UK, now is in a tough political spot. Without Powell's backing, Blair's position collapses and the UK partially withdraws. They still vow to support the US with intelligence, aid and diplomatically, but not with boots on the ground. The same goes for Australia and Poland. And more skeptical nations, like France and Germany, pull out entirely. The coalition of the willing has largely collapsed. Suddenly, the US seems far more isolated on the world stage. And that is big news back in America. Without the coalition of the willing, another crucial piece of war justification just went missing. And now, Bush is in a really tough spot. Invading Iraq with a smaller coalition, weaker domestic support and political vulnerability is very risky. But pulling out this late is political suicide. So what does he choose, the rock or the hard place? Bush believed failure to act would signal weakness post 9/11, but would he risk his entire presidency to prove it? Yes he would. This is George W. Bush with Dick Cheney breathing down his neck we are talking about. To fully avoid the Iraq war, Colin Powell would need to bring key members of the Joint Chiefs, State Department and Congress to his side in a very short time window. And with Cheney and Republican hawks working around the clock to discredit him, that's very unlikely. So is this whole divergence point all for nothing? Everything is still the same, right? Absolutely not. America still invades Iraq on March 20, 2003, but this time they are alone. No British, Australian or Polish troops are fighting by their side. Colin Powell resigns the same day and goes on countless interviews criticizing the invasion. And with Powell's resignation, the media reports much more aggressively about the Iraq war. There are nightly reportings on the weak evidence and front-page accusations of intelligence manipulation. Imagine you're a US soldier in Iraq in 2003. The war has just started and you're hearing every day on news feeds that half of Americans think the war shouldn't be happening at all. Morale quickly collapses. But still, even with weaker morale and no direct support from allies, US military might still dominates Iraq. Baghdad still falls by April 9, 2003. Saddam Hussein still goes into hiding. And crucially, American soldiers still don't find any evidence that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And that is a way bigger deal now. Overnight, Bush loses all his credibility. Colin Powell, meanwhile, gets vindicated and quickly turns into the most respected statesman in modern US history. Throughout 2003, Powell has to testify in several congressional investigations. Bush's approval rating quickly drops below 50% and he's beginning to get desperate. He orders even more troops to search for Saddam Hussein, hoping that capturing the dictator will save him. Like in our time, Saddam is captured by pure chance on December 13, 2003, but it doesn't change much about Bush's approval ratings. American troops in Iraq now get a new assignment, nation building. Bush calculates that if he can genuinely turn Iraq towards democracy, he might be able to save his re-election bid. By the 2004 election, he campaigns on having captured Saddam Hussein and working around around the clock to bringing democracy to Iraq. He publicly admits that the weapons of mass destruction evidence was weak, but Iraqis still needed to be liberated either way. He spins the invasion as America having saved Iraq from a brutal dictatorship, but the reality is of course different. Iraqis are suffering, their country is in ruins, and it was all because of a lie not even Bush's own cabinet members believed. Democrats by that point are all staunchly anti-war, and the Democratic primaries are even more heated in this timeline. Democrats are basically fighting over who opposed the Iraq war the hardest. Howard Dean, with his populist energy, performs much better. His infamous scream hurts his campaign far less. But still, many Americans fear that he is not the right man to bring back the respect America enjoyed on the international stage. John Kerry, meanwhile, voted against the invasion and is generally seen as more competent. John Kerry narrowly wins the Democratic primaries against Dean and is now facing incumbent President Bush. Bush still has some of that post-9/11 credibility, but with Iraq being seen as a failure from day one, he has no strong re-election bid. Kerry, meanwhile, calls Bush out for overstepping. His narrative is that Bush handled 9/11 well initially and then quickly overstepped his power, and that is a powerful attack. John Kerry defeats Bush, but people didn't select Kerry because they like him so much, but rather because they want him to fix Bush's mistakes. He's kinda like the Joe Biden of this timeline, the boring politician elected to clean up a mess previously created. John Kerry has just been dealt one of the worst hands you could get as president. He has to handle a war that has already turned into a quagmire, a public suspicious of government, no international legitimacy, and an exhausted military. But being a strong diplomat, Kerry quickly manages to re-establish ties with the UN. His plan is to internationalize the occupation, train Iraq forces rapidly, and then withdraw. That plan sounds good on paper, but Iraq is a true clusterfuck with no easy way out. Early in his presidency, Kerry focuses on internationalizing the occupation. He seeks UN peacekeepers, NATO support, and he wants to share the financial burden. But other countries aren't very motivated to help the US. Sure, the international community trusts Kerry like they trusted Clinton before, but countries don't want to help pay for something they didn't cause. And that's not even the worst of it. Not only is Kerry struggling abroad, he's also struggling domestically. Hurricane Katrina devastates the US. In our timeline, Bush's weak response completely destroyed his credibility. Kerry, of course, reacts better than Bush. He deploys the National Guard faster, coordinates better with local politicians, and doesn't do weird photo ops. But Katrina still hurts him politically. The hurricane exposes how unprepared FEMA is and still turns into a huge symbol of racial and class divide. In his first year, Kerry's popularity already plummets. But things only get worse. Inside Iraq, instability intensifies much quicker than in our time. Without the coalition of the willing, the US struggles alone. Sunnis in Iraq boycott reconstruction efforts. Shia militias fill security gaps. Kurds in the northeast make moves for autonomy. Insurgent networks expand. Sure, Kerry is far more competent than Bush, but this structure of the occupation is already broken. By 2006, US casualty numbers climb and Iraqi forces are nowhere near ready. By that point, Kerry realizes that Iraq is a lost cause. Either he stays and continues piling up US casualties and death, or he withdraws now and faces the blame for Iraq's collapse. Kerry decides that his best bet is to try to withdraw as cleanly as possible. By June 2006, American troops begin a staged withdrawal from Iraq. And if you paid attention in the last few years, you know that such withdrawals don't really work. Just like Afghanistan, Iraq quickly collapses. John Kerry really is the Joe Biden of this timeline. But unlike with Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal, where one powerful terror force, the Taliban, took over, Iraq completely fractures. The country enters a state of civil war with no clear dominant side. Tens of thousands of Iraqi refugees make their way towards Europe. Colin Powell, meanwhile, is a frequent member of congressional meetings discussing the Iraq war. By 2007, he is easily seen as America's most respected politician. He's the face of honor, integrity, and perhaps most importantly, he's the anti-Cheney, anti-Bush face in the Republican Party. He tried to save America from the chaos the country is now in, and because of that, he easily becomes the Republican frontrunner for the 2008 2008 election. And I know it's very speculative if he would even run, but the path here is so obvious, it's hard to imagine he wouldn't run. He's the most respected Republican in the entire country. The only ones that hate him are Republican hawks, the very people responsible for America's current mess. In early 2008, Powell faces off against John McCain in the Republican primaries. Both are staunchly against the war, but Powell has even more credibility than John McCain. I know that sounds crazy given that it's John McFucking-Cain we're talking about here, but with Powell openly opposing and even resigning because of the invasion, he even edges out McCain when it comes to integrity. So Powell claims the nomination, and he soon announces Chuck Hagel as his running mate, one of the few Republicans who both in this timeline and ours stood against the Iraq War from day one. Together, they form a powerful ticket of integrity. John Kerry, meanwhile, is associated as the crisis manager president. He oversaw Katrina and America's withdrawal from Iraq. And while he managed both better than most other politicians would have, they still taint his image massively. Is that fair? Absolutely not. But politics isn't fair. By 2008, Kerry is already seen as a weak transitional president. And then, as the cherry on top, the housing market collapses. Kerry now faces a new, unprecedented crisis. And he doesn't even have strong congressional backing, bipartisan support, or even a unified narrative of what went wrong. Still, on paper, he handles the crisis well. He passes similar laws to how Obama reacted in 2009. But Kerry can't provide quick fixes, especially not quick enough before the election. The crisis simply is too big. If Republicans ran a new conservative hawk again that voted for the Iraq War, Kerry might have had a chance to get re-elected, but Republicans run Colin Powell. Just imagine you're a voter in this timeline. You can choose between the cleanup guy and Colin Powell, the man who stood up to Bush, Cheney, and an unjust invasion. And while Kerry is caught up in the financial crisis, Colin Powell campaigns. He rallies moderates, military families, and gains credibility in the Rust Belt. He rebrands the GOP as sober, competent, realistic, and supportive of NATO and diplomacy. It's honestly hard to overstate how popular this alternate Colin Powell would be. In this alternate world, he's almost like a modern political hero. He's the one politician who didn't lie. But would he be a good leader? On November 4, 2008, Colin Powell wins the election and becomes the first black president in the history of America. But just like John Kerry did 4 years ago, Colin Powell enters the Oval Office during a time of crisis. He begins approaching the financial crisis the way he knows best, by being pragmatic and bipartisan. During the transition, he forms a team of rivals, appointing respected economists from both parties. And unlike John Kerry, President Powell has a superpower, immense credibility across the aisle, and that helps him quickly pass a massive stimulus package, similar in size to the one Obama passed in our time. But unlike Obama's, it's more focused on infrastructure and less towards bailouts. Powell's military background gives him the authority to handle the crisis in a pragmatic way, without being labeled as a socialist. Obama had to prove he's not the leftist radical many feared he is during the crisis. Powell has already proven himself and can thus act more decisively. In this alternate timeline, America recovers slightly faster from the 2008 financial crisis than in our time. However, that does come at a cost. Powell, a Republican president, has to raise taxes to pay for the stimulus packages, and that gives birth to a new wing inside his own party. The Tea Party still emerges, though weaker and focused mainly on internal GOP influence. Internationally, Powell leverages his credibility to broker a UN-led peacekeeping mission in Iraq, focusing on humanitarian aid and supporting a fragile, decentralized Iraqi government. Still, the Iraqi civil war continues, but it's contained as a regional tragedy rather than an American quagmire. Powell's true focus lies on Afghanistan though, the quote-unquote good war. He initiates a troop surge in 2009, but with a clearer counter-insurgency strategy and a stronger push for NATO burden sharing. He also cultivates a strong stance against Iran. Domestically, besides his handling of the financial crisis, Powell remains very moderate. Like Obama, he achieves a bipartisan healthcare reform, although it's more similar to the Romney-Care model. It's focused largely on individual mandates. The left sees it as too weak, but still a step in the right direction. By that point, the neocon hawk wing of the GOP is practically dead. The party consists of two flanks now. The Tea Party movement we all know and hate, and there's the Powell wing of the GOP, which dominates the party. By the 2010 midterms, many Republicans run with a Powell-inspired messaging. Republicans are now seen as competently compassionate, but in a conservative kind of way. The GOP is not the party of anti-progress like in our time, but rather the party of slow, stable progress that ensures to keep old values alive. And Colin Powell is a popular president, with his approval rating almost constantly sitting over 60%. And then he scores another big victory. In May 2011, Navy SEALs find and take out Osama bin Laden. And while Powell's military background had nothing to do with that success, the American public quickly attributes the capture to that. The common narrative on American streets is, we have elected a military president, and now the military took out the most wanted terrorist in history. Powell's popularity surges, and his re-election bid seems rock solid. Democrats, meanwhile, struggle with their messaging. The party is much more divided than the GOP, mainly between populists like John Edwards and neoliberals like Hillary Clinton, who both are the main contenders for the 2012 nomination. Obama also runs, but without the context of the 2008 election, his bid really isn't as strong. The whole hopeful aura that surrounded him is now gone, since America has already elected a black president. In this timeline, Obama is just another talented centrist, one that doesn't have the track record of Clinton or the truly progressive ideas of Edwards. The nomination race is tight. Younger voters put their weight behind Edwards, while the political establishment and media supports Hillary Clinton. Ultimately, I think Hillary would defeat Edwards, similarly to how she defeated Bernie Sanders in 2016. But still, she can't defeat Powell. America is in a good spot. The economy is recovering, the Iraq quagmire is largely over, and President Powell is a respected global leader. He easily wins re-election against a Hillary Clinton that struggles to find a good attacking angle. But Powell's challenges aren't over. Moderates are happy with Powell, but voters both on the left and right feel left out by his policies. Yeah, the economy recovered and America regained respect, but things aren't that great for working class Americans. Especially libertarians and the far right aren't happy with Colin Powell. Their rallying cry is an opposition to Powellism, which they see as Democrat light. And internationally, things aren't rosy now, just because Iraq is largely resolved. Powell responds cautiously to the Arab Spring. He supports allies like Mubarak in Egypt, but pushes for reform, and unlike Obama, avoids military intervention in Libya. His doctrine is one of principled engagement, avoiding another large-scale nation-building project. The following Syrian civil war quickly turns into one of his biggest foreign policy headaches. Under immense pressure, he authorizes limited airstrikes against Assad, but absolutely avoids putting boots on the ground. And that is the first time Powell is perceived as kinda weak. His actions draw criticism from all sides, and many call him too moderate and too cautious. But that caution quickly pays off as Russia invades Crimea in 2014. In this timeline, America is far less distracted and NATO coordination is stronger under Powell. The West reacts more uniformly earlier. Powell pushes for harsher sanctions on Russia and pressures NATO countries to increase their defense spending targets from 2 to 3%. Powell also begins talks with Sweden and Finland, trying to get them to join NATO. Both countries enter negotiation talks, but without quick results. Still, the fact that there even are negotiations serves as a deterrent too. But domestically, Powell isn't as strong. His second term is hampered down by the now pretty powerful Tea Party caucus in Congress. Following the 2014 midterms, he fails to get bipartisan support in Congress for basically anything. And thus, for the last 2 years of his presidency, Powell doesn't pass anything meaningful. But on the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really matter. Colin Powell has brought respect back into politics, regained America's standing on the global stage, moved the GOP away from neoconservative hawks. He's no Lincoln, but he's largely seen as a good leader. By the end of his second term, Colin Powell's approval rating still is slightly over 60%, all because he didn't lie at 11:03 AM on February 5th, 2003. I know everything I just presented seems hard to believe because Colin Powell is kinda disgraced in our time thanks to the lies he helped spread. But before all that, he truly was one of the most respected politicians of this time. Really, all I changed in this scenario is that Colin Powell remained the man he was in the 90s. He could have been an incredibly successful politician and even president, a modern version of Eisenhower, but he had to lie. Usually my videos don't really have a moral of the story kinda ending, but I guess this time you could say that integrity pays off in the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing and help me reach those juicy 20,000 subscribers before 2026. Today's topic was actually chosen through a Patreon poll, which ended in a tie, so I posted it on YouTube and it also got kinda close. I guess we have to thank both my loyal patrons and all the audience members who voted on it. Oh, and since the votes were so close, my next video will be the Chernobyl scenario, which barely lost, which honestly surprised me since the consequences of that scenario are more far-reaching and large-scale than this one. Anyway, while you wait for that video, you can check out my video about one judge voting differently in 2000, where one seemingly small decision also changes everything.